educational challenges and experiences of people seemingly so different from us connect to our own experiences? And why does this have any relevance to us when we all have our own problems to deal with? This is one of the questions that we're exploring when we're in conversation with Miss Katie Elko, former counselor at Woodbridge Academy, which some of you guys are probably already familiar with. As for her introduction, well, I can't do it justice. Let's ask her herself and get straight into the interview. Thank you for being here. I'm Avika from For the Record. Our next guest really does need no introduction, especially when it comes to the Woodbridge Academy community. Today, I'm going to be interviewing our former counselor and also a former math instructor, Miss Katie Elko. So first, there's so many things to talk about. I want to talk about her time at Woodbridge. I've also been there for 2 years before I moved, but I want to give her a chance to introduce herself and her background. So I'm going to give her the chance to do that now.
Hi, as you know, I'm Mrs. Elko, Katie Elko, and I started out back in the year 2000 as really 1998, to be honest.
Oh, wow.
I just switched to the Middlesex County vocational schools, we were known as back then in 2000. But I started out as an educator, a math teacher in 1998. And math has changed probably a great deal since then. And the students have changed as well, but we'll get on with that. And once I taught for about 10 years, the burnout was coming. Nobody likes math, so to speak, except people like me. Then we're considered a little strange, but I love math. And but eventually I saw there was no way I could continue doing it for 25 years. So I became a counselor, and I went back to school to get my certificate in school counseling. And I became a counselor first at the Perth Amboy campus of Middlesex County VOTEC. And then I went to Woodbridge Academy, and then we became the magnet schools. And I ended my career just recently at the Woodbridge Academy Magnet School.
Got it. So thank you for that. Now, before we get into your experiences at Woodbridge, I want to backtrack quite a few years, actually decades, to when you were a student yourself, when you were either in grade school or college. I'm aware that a lot has changed in education since then in terms of resources, awareness for learning disabilities, and support. So growing up, what do you think the biggest challenge you faced in school was? And how do you think that might have translated into your future career? Do you think that maybe this challenge would have been, handled differently today?
Most definitely. I think my biggest challenge back in, not to date myself, but it was the 80s and for the high school years. And my issue was I did love math, as I already said, and they didn't think back then that girls could do math. So they were trying to hold me back. And when I wanted to take calculus, they're like, oh no, you should take pre-calculus. And I'm like, no, I'm ready for calculus. And it was probably the first time in my school career that I advocated for myself. And I'm so glad I did, because having that calculus background in high school enabled me to, go right into calculus in college. And I ended up a math major in college. So, had I not advocated for myself back in the 80s, that wouldn't have happened. Nobody would have let me excel in math if I didn't say, no, I can do this. So that's a big change. We wouldn't do that to females today.
Absolutely. And I think that also pertains to a lot of, not for us, thankfully, because we're growing up in a time where we were given equal opportunities, but a lot of our teachers, like I specifically remember Miss Bowen always telling us, and Senora Wexler, that, as a woman, you always constantly have to be putting yourself out there and advocating for yourself, because if you don't do that and you don't stand your ground, then you're going to get walked all over. Even though times have changed a lot, there's still, especially because a lot of us want to go into medicine or some similar field, in order to survive in a field like that as a female, you have to constantly be advocating for yourself. So that's just something that I noticed was similar to what you explained, something that our teachers have been constantly drilling into our minds. So in contrast, what do you think some of the, I know there's a lot, but what are the biggest challenges in education today?
The biggest challenges of today are honestly those that come from social media. Social media has had such an effect on, teenage brains, and the fact that you guys have had, we're now coming to the students that have had an electronic device in their hand their entire life. Whereas I was out of college already when I got my first cell phone. I was probably 10 years out of college before I got my first cell phone.
Wow.
Yeah, because they didn't exist. Or, they were only for very, 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 Forbes.com type businessmen. But it's changed everything. The fact, the connection students have with people now is so different than the connections we had back then. And it's, social media puts so much more stress on individuals, especially at the teenage years, that we didn't face. So that, I thank everything every day that I did not grow up in a time of social media.
Absolutely. And I think social media contributes to two big challenges for us, from my perspective at least. One, the very obvious, the short attention spans. It is a genuine, real thing. I mean, especially because we've grown up in a time, we haven't known a time without the internet. So somehow, like, always constantly having access to the internet, we don't even know how to be like bored anymore, if that makes sense. Like, we immediately go to the easiest like source of entertainment. But I feel like that's messed with both our attention spans and also our ability to like be creative and think, which is so important in education. Because if we constantly have a cure for boredom, then we don't really like think outside of the box, and like boredom often leads to your best ideas. So I think that that's one of the bigger things. But also social media means constant like things being like, especially now, like I see, especially going to my junior year, I'll always see things about, oh, these are what colleges you can get into with this GPA. And like, I'll always see these things, and I don't know how my stats of how I got into this big name school. And it's just constant propaganda being fed to you that just contributes more to the pressure you're already feeling. And it's just like, it contributes to everything we're going and just amplifies it in a way. You see all of those things that we're constantly thinking about reflected right back at us when we go there. So that's another aspect. But now I want to pivot a little more to your experiences interacting with students, because I can talk about my own personal experiences, but every single kid my age has a different experience. So do you have any particular story or anecdote of a student overcoming a learning challenge during your time as a counselor or an instructor?
Absolutely. You're totally right on that. I would have students that when you learn their background and where they had to sleep that night before, and you're like, whoa, how did you even get here this morning? And to what you were saying, I think for them, and we saw a lot of that where they're caring for their younger siblings, or they were even, once they turned 16, having to get a job to contribute. So here it is, they're still, in school, and very malleable years of their lives, but they're doing adult things, and education almost becomes secondary. And I think it's an issue that really is probably the root cause of when they're talking about cyclical socioeconomic levels of people, where it's just generational. And it's because they're being adults at a way too young of an age. Just to survive. So, if you're barely surviving, school doesn't mean as much to you, and you don't see it as the way out when you don't have the time to give to it. Because yes, it is a way out, but not if you're, having to worry about feeding yourself to survive. So, no, you touched on a very good point there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it was like, I've been talking about a lot of these things in previous episodes, but to hear this from you as an educator, like you've actually worked with students who've experienced all this, makes everything that we've been talking about feel a lot more tangible. Because like, I haven't seen or experienced as much of this, but I've been doing my best to try and understand. So I think that was really helpful for me to know.
Yeah,
And
no, it is real. It is
yeah.
true. And, I saw it even in my counseling at Perth Amboy. At that campus, there are students,
Mhm.
either caring for the young or working to help pay the rent. And then in East Brunswick, you'd hear stories of my students that would just, and, that's when I was teaching. And, maybe the police were at their house that the night before, you don't know what's going on. And then you hear about that and you're like, wow, you were up all night and how did you make it here? And then you heard, other students that they sleep on a couch every night, and if they don't get home early enough, they don't get the couch and they're on the floor. Like, it is very real, and it is right here in America. So it's something I'm glad that the younger generation is talking about and has realized, because many of us are privileged and we have to acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And I honestly often see this thing, and I think it's very true. And it goes like, you have to change your mindset. Although, yes, studying can be so draining and exhausting and like pushing you to your limit sometimes. And obviously, you have to keep that healthy balance and in check. But you have to remember that it's not that you have to study, it's you get to study. It's a privilege to, like, that's your main concern. My main concern is, hey, how am I going to pass this test on Thursday? How am I going to make the time for this? It's a privilege for that to be your main concern, your education, rather than your basic survival. So I think that's a really, like, that kind of encompasses everything we were just talking about. But now, speaking about our own experiences and pivoting a little bit from that, I want to know, after working with the students at Woodbridge or the other VOTEC school, what do you think is something that, parents or other members of the community need to understand about these kids from the magnet schools, their perspectives and what they're going through?
Okay, so for the traditional magnet schools, parents need to understand that, they're getting a trade and they're going, they may or may. Okay, so for the magnet schools, parents have to understand that their child is getting a trade, and that trade may often put them in a spot where they're not going to go to college. They might not need it. Now, some of the trades obviously do require a college education, but many don't. So as long as you have one or the other, your child will be okay as long as they have a career. But then, of course, we have the other side where it's the academy magnets. And yes, we're all going to go to college and get postgraduate degrees in order to succeed. But for those things, the thing the parent has to realize the most is their students that we accept into the Middlesex academies, they put enough stress on themselves to do well in school. The parents actually could back off and not put additional stress on them, because even though they're the privileged ones to concentrate on academics and getting their education, they, how can I word this? They are treating it like you were saying. You change your perspective that I am privileged enough to be able to concentrate on my academics, so I'm going to look at it from that perspective and maybe honor it a little more. So for that, the students that get accepted to the academy magnet schools, they have that intrinsically in their head that they need to do well. So their parents need to know that they can come to that conclusion, just like you did, on your own, that they're going to work as hard as they can for that grade. And they don't need the extra stressors. It's hard enough to be a teenager. They don't need the extra stressors at a school like the academy, where we bounce ping pong back and forth of who's number one, or at least the top five. They don't need that extra stress of their parents saying, when you're at this elite school, why did you not get an A? Well, if you're in an elite school like that, A is for outstanding. Obviously, you're not always going to be the most outstanding in the room. So you're not always going to get that A. And I think that the stress the parents put on some of our students, not all, but for the additional stress for those parents that do put that on the student, that's something they need to learn, that coming to the academy has its own pride and its own view, and those students are bright enough that they're going to figure it out for themselves, that this is their job and this is what they're going to concentrate on, and they want to do well. And so if they don't get that A one day in one class, on one test, on whatever that is, they're going to be striving for it enough that the parents don't have to add to that. They can back off.
Absolutely. And I think, I was actually talking to my friend who's, still at the academy, but I was talking to her about this. And the way I said it was that there's a weird kind of both a superiority and an inferiority complex that comes with going to an academy magnet. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that. It's that going to a magnet, whenever you step out of that magnet, you've gotten this idea that oh, you're at a magnet school, it's choice school, you've been chosen. And while all that is true, it gives you sort of this idea that, hey, I go to this choice school, that means I'm already blah, blah, and blah. But then you have the complete flip side of the experience, which is when you are in the school, the flip side of that experience is that when you're in this environment all the time, you're constantly feeling you're not as good as your classmates. There's this crazy amount of competition. Enough has been said about that. So it's almost like I literally experienced this. I was at this prep little event that was happening at the library, and there was this one instance where I got this question right. And I was like, hey, I got this question right. That's great. Most of the people here didn't. And then I remember, and then immediate follow-up thought was, hey, everyone back at Woodbridge would have easily gotten this one question right. So it's this weird thing that plays in your mind that you are both not as good as everyone else, and also this weird superiority complex. So it's strange being an academy kid, but it's also, yes, I completely agree with what you said, that I think they have enough motivation to get through the stuff themselves. The only thing that comes in their way, mostly, besides the toxic competitive mentality, is burnout, which is genuinely just from not having enough time to just be a regular teenager. I think you need to have the best of both worlds. You need to maintain a healthy social life and also an academic life. And I think that helps balance out burnout. And we talked about this in our very first episode that came out with the show, which was all about burnout and academic pressure and what we can do about it. And so I want to tell you about some of the solutions we came up with and maybe get your opinion on them. So for burnout and academic pressure specifically, we talked about shifting focus to more project-based learning, because that way, even if students don't excel in standard core subjects, maybe when they apply these core subjects to real world things, maybe, let's do a project where we, mock a business or do a research thing on this. Maybe then people's natural talents will come out and show, and it'll also not be as taxing on them, mentally. That was one of our ideas that we came up with. And our other idea that we came up with was balancing out the school day, maybe starting school later and implementing, we have an advisory period at school, so maybe implementing things like that, breaks. Those are some of our solutions. What do you think are things that we can do at both a school or a district level to help kind of balance out that burnout while still keeping people engaged and academically enriched?
Well, I think you're, talking about the project-based learning thing, we've been trying to get towards that in the last several years. I'm sure you've noticed.
Yes.
And some of your teachers at the academy teachers have just, jumped right on board. And then, of course, you're always going to have people that have been teaching so long, it's a hard switch for them. But so you get a mix at the academy. I'm not sure about Edison, but it's probably the same, that there's a mix of teachers. Some embraced it, some didn't. It's also sometimes easier in some subjects than others to do those project-based learning activities. So, I think we're working on it. I think the district as a whole is going to continue working with the teachers to, make us more project-based. It is certainly the desire of those above. So I don't think there's anything y'all even have to do for that, because that's what's happening already. Is, you know, the central office from above is wanting us to move more project-based. That's why there isn't that old time. Well, you were only there 2 years, so you weren't there. Like, it was probably 5 years. Well, pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, we would have, you know, true final exams, and it would be final exam week. You want to see our academy students stressed. That was stress. Or they'd have 2 exams a day for 4 days, and then the last 2 days of school were like, if you got sick, and they were makeup days. So we had 6 half days back then at the end, and it was for 2 finals a day. And they were all traditional, standard final, you know, open-ended, multiple choice, all of that horrible stuff that y'all hate. But it definitely, it's stress-inducing. It really is. So for that, I think the district's on a good path, and there'd be nothing you'd have to do for that one. That's going to happen in any other school. You know, now that you're in Texas or something, you go to, the student council and you talk to them, and you get them to then relay that desire to the administration. And because they're supposed to go between students and administration. So that's what you could do somewhere else. As far as breaking up the day, as you've seen, me as the advisor of student council just happen to have that, role as well as the counseling one. I was always all for trying to break up that day, give you guys a little break, a little fun. And whenever I could, I did. But, everybody needs to teach, and you need to learn there's only so many days, school days. So it does become difficult. I kind of like the idea of where you were saying you're new. Is this what I understood, that your new school has an advisor period, or is it just something you guys bounced around?
So it's an advisory period, which doesn't begin until the end of this month, but it's basically between second and third block, and it's like this half an hour of not constructive learning time. Like, you kind of settle in an area of your choice, you kind of stay there, and you have your own time to do whatever you want. Since we don't have recess or whatever as high school students, I guess it's the equivalent of that. Or if you need to make up something, you would also do that during advisory.
I really love that idea. It's almost like you would extend the, sorry. Let's just, Max. All right, I'll say that again. So I really like that idea. I think it's something, hold on, sorry. Let me, Max, come here. Come. Don't start. All right, I think if I get him away from that other dog, he won't bark as much. So, all right. So the idea of an advisory period is very interesting to me, because I think it is definitely something schools could work into a schedule, especially a block schedule. Because if you just took, say, 7 minutes from each of the 4 blocks, there's 28 minutes right there. And even maybe, take 2 from homeroom or something, and there's 30 minutes that you could attach to the lunch periods or something like that. They work around that. And it would be a good opportunity. It would absolutely be a good opportunity for students to gather. Maybe that could become, the club periods, or the making up work time, and that would be something for, as far as the way the, Woodbridge, Middlesex schools work, that would definitely be something that I would say you'd talk to student council about in a suggestion for something to look into. And the way it would work is the students that create this idea and this plan would go to student council, talk to them, get them on board, and then they would talk to the principal, whoever that principal would be at the time, whether it's Mr. Fuller or somebody who, comes after him, who knows when they would, get to this. And then the principal would then talk to the board, the central office, and see if it's something that they could get approved and work on. Because yes, burnout for you guys at the academy level is very real, and that is, and from what you've seen in your 2 years, I'm sure you could probably assume that our administration as it stands now would definitely be open to hearing such things, because, it's been the current administration that has enacted the, no projects, no work, no tests over break, and you can't have a test the first day back from break either. You have to wait 3 days and, all that, because we are aware that you guys should be kids. A lot of times, students would be signing up for this, that, and the other thing for their summer. And I'm like, well, when are you going to have fun? Like, it's always been in the back of my mind that you guys have to be teenagers too. And, yes, you're all very, very bright. And yes, you're wanting to pursue great dreams of becoming doctors and anything in the medical field that you want to pursue in the future. And that's wonderful, but you don't have to be an adult at the age of 14 and never give yourself a summer again until you become a doctor, and then you're never having a summer anyway. Like, no, you need teenage years. You should, be enjoying yourselves, having parties on the weekend, not only being able to, have study group parties. So that's not a party. You need to relax. You need to let loose. We all do. That doesn't end at adulthood either. Everybody needs time. We just do it differently when we're at different ages. But teenagers need that social outlet, and it's definitely something that does get a little squashed at the academy. And I'd always try to watch for that in students to see when they were approaching burnout and try to give them some tips. But it's pretty hard when you're getting pressure from all sides. And and then I know there's you hear it from you hear one opinion from somebody you respect, say like me, and then you hear another opinion from somebody you respect as a teacher saying the exact opposite of me. You're torn, and then you've got your parents probably saying a third idea. So it's tough. Being a teenager is hard for multiple reasons.
Absolutely. And I think that the best way to go about this, which is also not fully in our power, but what I've understood from all of the different people that I've talked to, is that you have to find a balance between, academically challenging and engaging. You have to have that going, but you also have to balance that with, ample time to rest, because also that's a skill that'll carry you through your life. Because if you don't, develop the ability to take a break or to strategies to not burn out, this is a time to learn that. And if we don't learn that now, I know it's going to be a problem for us when we grow up, because it's not like the work is going away. We're not retiring once we leave school. In fact, it's the quite opposite. It gets a lot harder. So I think it's really important. But I think when we're thinking about solutions for this, we have to balance both things out. And for that, we need all different kinds of people's perspectives. So on that note, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing your perspective. It was genuinely really helpful, and I know everyone's going to love hearing this episode. Do you have anything more you want to add? I know we're running a little short on time, but I've got enough time if you want to add anything.
Oh, so your audience is mostly Woodbridge Academy or all the Middlesex academies, or?
No, it's a bit of a mix. It's honestly, right now, my audience is just people that I know. So that includes people outside of Woodbridge, but also a couple people over here, people outside of Woodbridge, but also the students inside Woodbridge. So. Excellent.
So, then I'll just keep it in general, then that, work for that work-life balance. You hear people say it all the time. That's, if you guys can figure it out now, just like you just said, Avika, it's going to go with you throughout your life. And having that work-life balance will be helpful no matter what career you pursue. But for those of you that are going to be doctors, medical school is going to be tough. So have that balance in place already and get your support systems going. It'll take you far.
Absolutely. And while we're doing all of this, like I remind everyone at the end of almost every single episode, is while you're navigating all of this and thinking about what we've talked about, always keep in mind that, the position you're in to be able to think about it like this is not the position that everyone else is in, just like we talked about. Keep in mind how the experiences of other people differ, And yeah, on that note, that's all I have for today. Thank you. Thank you, Miss Elko, for being here. And that's all for today.
Thank you for having me, Avika.